On behalf of William and Mary, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Trailblazing Women of Conservation. I think we all agree that as we face unprecedented conservation challenges and an uncertain future, there is a critical need to bring together a diverse community of creative leaders who can deliver innovative conservation solutions that transcend traditional boundaries. William and Mary, with its long tradition of interdisciplinary work, excellence in research and education, innovative culture, and global expertise, is well positioned and ready to take on this challenge. This year, William and Mary launched a new Institute for Integrative Conservation, thanks to the support of a generous donation from an alumna. Its mission is to cultivate an inclusive network of experts from conservation organizations and from across the William and Mary community, who will work together to develop innovative real-world solutions and to foster the capacity of the next generation of conservation leaders. Through applied research, internships, and innovative curriculum, William and Mary students will be directly engaged in supporting conservation partners with addressing real challenges through the integration of disciplines, knowledge, and partners. Through this real-life experience, students will gain the skills necessary to be effective conservation leaders. And as we embark on this call to action, we are rooted in one of our university's most critical values: belonging. At William and Mary, we strongly believe that inclusion and empowerment of diverse people and perspectives is the key to effective solutions. It is no coincidence that for its first public event, the Institute for Integrative Conservation has chosen to focus on the importance of gender inclusivity in conservation. If we are truly going to be successful in our mission to find solutions to global conservation challenges, we need to ensure that this community that we cultivate is inclusive of all genders, races, ethnicities, cultures, perspectives, and viewpoints. I would like to thank National Geographic for graciously allowing us to screen their documentary, Women of Impact. Also, I would like to thank Kristine Zeigler from Plant Women for partnering with us on this event, and all the amazing women leaders who have volunteered to share their stories and perspectives with us tonight. I would also like to thank the alumni from Society of 1918, who were invited to participate in this panel discussion and who are committed to empowering and engaging women in all aspects of the university. It is through these important partnerships and the engagement of our William and Mary community that we will be successful in this important mission. Again, on behalf of William and Mary, I would like to welcome you all here tonight. I would like to thank you for participating in this important event this evening, celebrating the trailblazing women of conservation.
Thank you so much, and I'm so thrilled to be with you all tonight. Exploration belongs to us all. We're not going to explore the planet properly unless we have the whole planet represented in that exploration. Ella's words are magnificent. I just love that. I believe in that. I want that. For all of you at the Briggs Amphitheatre in Williamsburg, for all of you joining us virtually from around the globe, for all the people living on the planet right now, I want that. For all the people who are yet to come, I want that. Planet Women is a startup. It's all about putting women at the forefront of solving our most critical environmental challenges so that we have a healthy planet for everybody. 7 years ago, about this time, I passed my check ride for my private pilot license. During my training, there was always an older gentleman hanging around the flight school in the hangars who was a Vietnam era pilot. He flew F-4 Phantoms. Everyone loved talking to him because he was someone you really wanted advice from because he had great pilot skills and he was also kind. And one day I got up the courage to ask him this question. I said, is there a difference between female pilots and male pilots? And he immediately said, nope, there are bad male pilots. There are bad female pilots. There are excellent male pilots and there are excellent female pilots. And I thought, well, thank goodness. So maybe I have a chance at doing this, you know, because so few women are pilots. I had a female flight instructor, and she's the reason that I was able to get my license, but she couldn't teach me everything. Like, there were just some things that weren't sinking into my head. So she recruited some of her colleagues to take me up every once in a while, you know, mix things up. Sometimes I would go up with much younger male pilots who are still in college or getting their degree. Other times I'd go up with really seasoned pilots. And it's that combination of that male and female leadership energy and all the knowledge that I think has made me into a proficient and safe pilot, not one more than another. And yet when it comes to solving problems, like the problems you're going to hear about that these amazing women are working on and focused on right now, whether it's climate change, invasive species, I don't know, saving the Amazon, saving the Congo Basin, working on the intersection between social justice and the environmental leadership that we all need, there's a big group that's left out. Planet Women believes that humanity makes the most strides when people of all backgrounds and all gender identities are tapped to solve our world's most challenging environmental problems. The problem, though, is that there's a lack of balance and a lack of diversity as you look at who is solving them. Let's look at governments. 94% of all governments led by men. Let's look at Fortune 500 companies. There are more women than ever on that list, but 93% are still men. 74% of our senators here in the United States are men. 94% of the pilots that I fly with are men. And I gotta say, I have not really experienced much discrimination, although I do fly with my husband and he's on the right seat, which is where you fly if you're not the pilot in command. And when we get out of the airplane, typically people will come up to him and say, oh, what kind of plane is your plane? Or, you know, where'd you fly in from? And he'll say, I don't know, ask her. So as we look at how to balance these teams that are tackling these enormously complex problems that governments and charities and businesses all must focus on, we know that women need to get to the top of organizations, but they're not getting there. Why? Why aren't they getting there? Well, there's some who say there's still a bias against female leadership, or perhaps we're not applying, we're not putting ourselves out there. Could be a combination of those and many other factors. But my friends, I think we're on the brink of something very exciting because of the pandemic, because of the upcoming election, because of the protests, because of all of the things that we are identifying as not working out so great for the planet. We know we need courageous women leaders to step forward. Just last month, the United Nations put out a report that said, of the 20 biodiversity targets that were established about a decade ago by 150 governments, those are the targets set in Japan. They're the targets set to achieve biodiversity goals. Of those 20, 0 have been met by any of those countries. We've met none of them. So I feel, and I know you all feel, that we're on the brink of something different. Tonight, we're joined by some trailblazing women who are showing us the way and taking strides for a more just, more inclusive, more creative, more joyful, more compassionate future. They have generously offered to share their time with all of you. And I know that for the undergraduates in the audience, you may look at us and say, oh, those are older women who figured things out. But believe me, I'm going to be getting just as much out of this and getting enough advice to fortify and fill the well as well. No matter your age or generation, you always need wise counsel. You always need to hear the good work. So are you ready to be inspired? I would like to introduce our 4 panelists tonight. I'll start with Paulina Arroyo. She was recently promoted to the Adaptive Management and Evaluation Director for the Environment Program at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. She's long been a leader in rights-based conservation. She's been the leader on the Andes and Amazon initiative there at the foundation. And the foundation, along with all its partners and grantees through all the work over the many years, has basically contributed to the conservation of half of the Amazon biome. Half. It's awesome. Welcome, Paulina. Erin Spencer, she's our William and Mary alumna, 2014, class of 2014. Really glad to have you back. I know you're not technically there on the campus, but spiritually, we are all there with you in the amphitheater. She's a marine ecologist, a science communicator, a National Geographic explorer, and she is getting her PhD right this moment at Florida International University studying sharks. And I want to hear all about sharks and what that's like to be down there with the hammerheads. She's also studying the prey of the sharks, which I think is really a great dimension, as well as the whole effect of climate change on sharks, on skates, on rays. Welcome to you, Erin. Next up, Dr. Tara Stawinski, our primatologist and president, CEO, and chief scientific officer of an organization I know we have all heard of and love and admire, and that's the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund International, which is dedicated to the study, the conservation, and the protection of gorillas. She just got back from Rwanda, and her team and her supporters are building this awesome campus where they're going to be training the next generation of conservationists, located right there in Volcanoes National Park, where the people and the gorillas live. Welcome to you, Tara. And last, Kristine Wilkinson, conservation biologist and educator, and another National Geographic explorer. She is also a PhD candidate at the University of California here at Berkeley. I'm also on the West Coast with Paulina and Kristine, and she's studying the human-wildlife conflict and impacts and interactions, but even better, and I'm just so proud and thrilled to have Kristine here. She's the co-founder of Black Mammalogists Week, which is an event dedicated to creating a network of Black mammalogists, addressing systemic racism, and developing opportunities for Black and people of color scholars in our movement. I mean, is this a woman of our times, or what? Do we need you? We need you all. So let's get warmed up, everybody. Big breath. Whew, it's gonna be so fun. The film that we all just watched, which is so excellent, there's so many juicy moments there, really talks about women who were first in science, or first to be in some professions like longshoremen, etc. These women showed us kind of like it can be done. Might be hard, but it can be done. Who is the woman that you would like to acknowledge tonight? A woman who has inspired you to take your own path. And I'll go in order on my screen. Can I start with you, Kristine Wilkinson?
Oh, so exciting. I get the first question. So it's really funny because I actually recognized several friends and mentors in that movie, which was really fun. Like Laylee, who I worked with for a little while a few summers ago. And yeah, just tons of inspiring people that I know in that film. But someone who I didn't see, her name is Dr. Kay Holekamp, and she runs the longest running hyena project in the world. It's in the Masai Mara in Kenya. And she's just a total badass. I hope I'm allowed to say that. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. And she, created the project herself, has been studying hyena behavior and anthropogenic impacts on hyenas, and has learned so much about them, is probably the foremost expert on spotted hyenas in the whole world. And she's also just a really, really fun, down-to-earth person. And for anyone who has worked through bureaucracies in conservation research, you'll know that it's really difficult to set up a brand new project and to keep that going. I'm sure Tara can speak to that. And so just having Kay as a role model, both personally advising me on my projects on spotted hyenas, but also just in general as a conservationist and as a person of integrity, has been really excellent for me. So that's how I want to acknowledge.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristine. Over to you, Tara. You're next on my screen here.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And I think that I definitely have to mention Diane Fossey as the person who started my organization, which is now the longest running gorilla research and conservation site in the world. But to think that she went there in 1967 as a woman alone with no scientific training and was really on her own for a long time in terms of, didn't have a lot of support from the government, didn't have a lot of support from local communities. And, at the time, people thought of gorillas as these ferocious, scary King Kong-like beasts. And she went and lived among them and got to know them as individuals and really changed how the world viewed them. And I think that that's a lot of the reason why mountain gorillas are still with us and are one of the few animals that are actually the only great ape that are increasing on the planet, because she taught people to love them. I think that's one of her biggest legacies. So, and I'm thrilled to be that her, she passed away in 1985, but that her organization has been able to continue on all this time and has over 210 people in Africa out every day fighting for gorillas.
That's awesome. Thank you, Tara. Erin, how about you? What woman would you like to acknowledge? Which women would you like to acknowledge tonight?
Well, I would love to mention, actually, again, like Kristine, one of the women in the documentary, Dr. Sylvia Earle. It's absolutely incredible to hear her stories about truly being the first woman in a lot of these marine science field experiences. And I had a personal experience with her as an intern at National Geographic when I was a sophomore at William and Mary, and I knew that she was in town, and I actually staked out her office for like an hour waiting for her to come back, just to tell her how much I appreciated her work. And it wasn't until she came back when I realized how kind of intrusive that strategy was, to just wait in her office until she came back. But she spoke to me with such grace and treated me like I was the most important meeting that she had all day, when it turns out she was en route to meet with the CEO of National Geographic. And so she's just truly an incredible person, not only in what she's achieved in the field of ocean conservation, but just a role model in action and one-on-one as well. So I'd like to acknowledge her.
Love Sylvia. Love it. Thank you so much, Erin. And Paulina, what about you? Which women or woman would you like to acknowledge tonight?
Well, thanks, Kristine. It's really wonderful to be sharing this moment with everyone. For me, it's a little bit more personal. I'd really like to recognize my mom, because I think she has always been sort of the inspiration and the rock for me. As a single mother, she was the first woman to go to university in the family. She was the first woman to leave Ecuador and move to the U.S., with a 3-year-old daughter, and just sort of forge a life here, and still embed in me, or instill in me, appreciation of language and culture. And so for me, that's sort of my formative years that have determined what I did after that. I've had many women mentors along the way, but I think because of her, I've always been more inclined to look for those female mentors, be they, Latinas or not. She always instilled in me the appreciation of life and nature, and being just true to myself.
Wonderful. And I know it's been so hard to be separated, and she's hunkering down in Ecuador, being safe, but hopefully she'll be able to watch this later and we can say, hi, Mom. We're all taking care of each other. Well, given all that we're experiencing right this second, if you're thinking about the pandemic or the upcoming election or protests or the Women's March this weekend, so much happening. What is your intention for tonight? What's the intention behind your conservation work? In other words, why do you do what you do? I'll start with you, Kristine Wilkinson.
That's a great question. And I think that I could probably go on for hours about why I'm really glad to be part of this panel tonight. But I'll try to make it short. So I really believe that women, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the term, are the best leaders to give our planet a fighting chance to thrive. I really believe that. And I think, unfortunately, like along with thousands of years of pushing aside women's opinions and suppressing their leadership, many patriarchal societies have also taught men and boys that they should suppress their emotions and their empathy. And I really think this empathy gap is a huge contributor to our major conservation challenges. So I think, like, for now, at least, and this is luckily starting to change over time, women have the advantage in the empathy department. And we need to be lifting up and supporting women leaders of all backgrounds to be conservation leaders. So I hope that me being here today can serve as just like a small piece of inspiration toward this end, for folks who are watching, or women who are watching, and want to see some folks who look like them up here.
Beautiful, beautifully said. Tara, how about you? What's your intention for tonight and your work?
Kristine, that was lovely. That's a hard act to follow. I would say that, you know, I got into this field because I loved animals and wanted to work with animals. But the longer I've been in it, the further away I am from the animals themselves. I don't get to spend time watching gorillas anymore. I have a lot of other responsibilities, but I just believe that I want to leave this planet a better place, hopefully, than when I joined it. And I have 2 young daughters. And I want to make sure that gorillas and hyenas and elephants and all of these wonderful animals that so inspired me as a child are still around when my daughters are my age. And so it means that I spend a lot of time away from my family. It's a difficult job. It's 24/7. I mean, I think I eat, breathe, and sleep what I do, but I just feel that I feel very honored to be in this position to hopefully make a difference and do something good for the planet, and be a role model to my daughters and other girls as well, and other women as well who are interested in this field.
Awesome. I hope they get a chance to watch this later. Erin, how about you?
These are all wonderful. And my intention for tonight is, when we're thinking about careers in conservation, you know, many of us on this panel are very lucky that we get to work with charismatic animals and charismatic places. And I think that where I'd really like to move is thinking about, instead of a career in conservation, it's how can all careers contribute to conservation? You know, whether we work in the business sector, the nonprofit sector, I mean, every job should have this element of conservation, because we're at this place in our planet that we all need to be applying all of our efforts and all of our skills to this idea of conservation. So I think part of what I really am trying to do personally and throughout my work is recalibrating what my idea of the field of conservation is, because it really should be applicable across disciplines.
Oof. Oh my gosh, you are all saying such good stuff. Recalibrating the field. Love it. Thank you so much, Erin. Paulina.
Well, I could just say ditto to all of that, because that's exactly what I was thinking. But I would build on what Erin says, that to me, my intent is always one, to build bridges. Early on in my career, I was always trying to build a bridge of dialogue between like rural communities, indigenous communities, and the conservation sector, when at a time those were not in dialogue. And now I still, even being at the foundation, the Moore Foundation, I feel that I'm still always building bridges between organizations to work together. Like, we need to find and build bridges for alliances, because we can't work in isolation anymore. The problems are usually much bigger than any one single organization or individual can face. So building those bridges, and then inspiring others independent of where you work. To be a conservationist now, you don't necessarily have to be a biologist. I'm not a biologist, and I've sort of forged my career in this, and working more from the social sciences and working with people. So I agree with Erin. I think we need to inspire everybody, no matter what your career is, no matter where you are, to be able to contribute to resetting our relationship with nature and having a balance.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I'm not a biologist either. but I try to translate all the good science that's done in our institutions into stories. And so you can see how marketing and storytelling and writing are also part of this. So the humanities, science, it all works together. It's a wonderful career. Well, speaking of careers, I want to hear, what was your first paying job? Kristine.
Really short answer. My first paying job was driving a golf cart around a golf course and selling snacks and making people hot dogs. And since we're on the subject of women and patriarchy, often people were offering me their 18-year-old sons as my boyfriend, and I was like, I'll take a tip in money only, thank you.
In lieu of that, cash would be appreciated. Thank you for sharing, Kristine. Erin, what was your first job?
My first job was cleaning tack at a horse farm, with like leather therapy and buffing things out. And I don't use that skill very much anymore, but I do have this one pair of leather boots that I wear in the fall, and they look immaculate.
Comes in handy.
Yeah, it does.
Tara, how about you? What was your first paying job?
My first paying job, I'm pretty sure, was babysitting. I did that, all through high school and even in college. Did a lot of babysitting, a lot of time with kids, which hopefully made me a good observer of behavior.
Great. Paulina.
So I grew up in Alexandria, Virginia. So my first paying job in high school was to work in an old age home, like the cafeteria. But to me, that was one way of just appreciating elders. And I loved listening to their stories. And even when I would just take them a meal to their room when they were too frail to come to the dining room, they just were desperate to talk to someone and to tell their stories. So that's always sort of stayed with me for a long time. When any of the work I do with communities like in the Amazon, I always go first to the elders to hear their stories and what they're thinking.
Oh, gorgeous. Gorgeous. And I'm sure they loved you being there because of your difference in age and the appreciation for the energy that you brought. Kristine, tell us about your first conservation job, or your first sort of dipping your toes into getting paid to do your dream job.
That's a good question. So it's interesting because a lot of my getting paid to do the dream things were like NSF fellowships and that kind of thing. I don't know if that counts, but I'll go for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, basically, similar to Ray, who you saw in the film, I kind of grew up in Queens, New York, watching these nature shows with these white guys talking, right? And I was like, I really want to be like them, but I don't know how to be like them. And I was running around trying to catch cockroaches and squirrels and cicadas, and I had no idea how to translate that into a career at all. But I was really lucky that when I applied to Cornell for my undergrad, a woman named Dr. Myra Schulman reached out to me from Cornell and said there was an NSF funded opportunity for basically to increase diversity in the sciences, where I would go to this place called Shoals Marine Laboratory. It's an island off the coast of Maine, and do science essentially and get paid a stipend to do it. So for every summer, I went back to Shoals and did various research, mostly on seabirds. So I guess that's my first paid experience. But then my first real independent experience in conservation was after I graduated from undergrad. I went and worked as the assistant manager of the Kasokwa Forest Project in Uganda, near Masindi, Uganda. And essentially there's a very small forest fragment called Kasokwa Forest, and there are chimps in there and baboons and colobus and some other species. And essentially monitoring the chimps, working with the field assistants who are worked for the project for a long time, and teaching them some new techniques for monitoring, and then also piloting some kind of education, hands-on education programs for people who live around the forest but don't know much about the primates that are in there. So I worked there and lived there for a year after college.
Awesome. Ooh, those both sound amazing. How about you, Erin, your first paid conservation gig?
So I think I'll also go with a grant So my first grant to do any sort of research was partially funded through Women Marry in the Monroe Scholars Program and partially funded through National Geographic. And that grant I almost didn't apply for, but it was actually a professor at Women Marry, Dr. Anne Marie Stock, that was like, well, you'll never get it if you don't apply for it. And why not you? And that was, I looked at that as such a pivotal moment where I was just never going to even put myself up for that opportunity without her encouragement, counting myself out of the race before I got there. So I studied invasive lionfish in the Florida Keys and looking at how people change their behavior to fight back essentially against this invasive species. And so I spent the summer in the Keys, and it was really an exercise in just doing field work. I completely mismanaged my budget and spent all my money on diving. So I ended up eating lionfish for most of the grant, which, we were hunting them anyway. And so I ended up eating them, and but now I'm much more judicious about my grant money, but it was just a wonderful experience and made me feel like this is something I could actually pursue as a career. So.
And you proved you could live off lionfish, so that was useful.
Yeah, I can tell you 100 recipes for the ways to eat lionfish.
Excellent. I will keep that in mind. Paulina, how about you? First gig.
Well, yeah, after graduating from University of Waterloo and Bachelor's of Environmental Studies, wasn't really quite sure what I could do, but my interest was definitely working with communities and natural resources management. So I went to Ecuador, where I hadn't lived there. I was born there, but I had never actually lived there or studied there or anything. And in fact, my Spanish was not very good. And so when I got there, my intent was to volunteer in any project that would just take me, as long as I would learn about working in tropical areas and working in conservation. And within a month, after meeting a few people, I was offered a full-time job. And I thought, my God, you're going to pay me to do this? I'll work for free. But it was a wonderful experience in Fundación Natura. It was at that time the largest environmental NGO, the almost only environmental NGO in Ecuador, and had opportunity to really just learn so much from working with rural communities, park rangers, the government, and always being almost the only woman almost every time in most of the settings. And certainly the only woman coming into the rural areas as a professional, and so that was always a bit of a challenge too with some of the community organizations that were usually the male president and so forth. So you had to find ways to or different strategies to be able to talk to the women in the communities. So that was my first kind of paying job, and what they basically said, well, we need somebody to write the reports for the donor, and nobody speaks English, so here. And that was it. I stayed for 18 years working in Ecuador after that.
Phenomenal. Now you're on the other side getting reports from grantees. Thank you, Paulina. Tara, how about you?
Well, I was originally going to be a vet. That's what I wanted to do. I had known from an early age that I wanted to work with animals, and I was accepted to vet school, and I went and did my master's in the UK in biology. And I finished a little bit early, and I said, well, I'm halfway to Africa. I've always wanted to go to Africa. I'm going to try and do that. And I'm going to age myself here by saying that there was no email at the time. So I wrote about 100 letters to people in the field saying, can I come and be a field assistant? I really just want to get some experience on the ground. And I heard back from exactly 2 people. Probably my letters didn't make it to most folks. And they didn't have opportunities, but then I was able to find a graduate student, and I went to Zimbabwe to study side-striped jackals. And I just completely fell in love with being in Zimbabwe, with the work. I never saw a jackal. They were nocturnal, they had radio collars on. We just sort of followed them around to get an idea of where they ranged. And but I fell in love with it, and it changed my trajectory. I came back and decided I wasn't going to do veterinary medicine, and applied to do a PhD in animal behavior instead. So it was very transformational for me.
I remember the days before email too.
Yep.
It was a very different place to be. And I can remember the first email I ever sent on campus when I was an undergrad. And I didn't realize that people could tell who it was from. So I sent it to this guy I had a crush on, thinking it was anonymous. Boy, I did not understand the technology. Okay, and on to kind of the theme of tonight, which is the empowerment of women. Why is this important? Why is women's empowerment, or more women leading, or more women running projects important to you? Can I start with you, Kristine Wilkinson?
Sure. Again, so many answers for this, but there are so many subtle and not so subtle ways that women are pushed out of or excluded from conservation and out of STEM fields more broadly. And specifically where I work, currently I work in Kenya. I don't think I said that. So I work in Kenya right now in and around Lake Nakuru National Park, with communities there, and also on carnivore movement through developed landscapes and carnivore conflict with people. And so in many of the places where I work, women are expected to be the family caretakers, and that can leave very little time for conservation work historically. And I think that's really changing a lot, which is amazing to see, as you saw in the film. But since part of my work involves community participatory mapping, so having people kind of draw on maps their experiences with carnivore conflict and their desired outcomes for conservation where they live, kind of spatially explicit experiences, I've put in place some kind of active strategies to make sure that women's voices are heard in that process, and that the issues they're facing are elevated to the top as much as the men in the community. So just, one example, it's a really simple fix, is having men and women come on separate days for the participatory mapping. And when you do kind of the co-ed participatory mapping instead, you can see a huge difference. Like when men or women are together, women are just, for the most part, are just quiet, and men will just take over. And that's just because, even we live in a patriarchal society here. So we know how that is, and it's just less subtle where I work. And so separating men and women so that women can really feel free to speak more freely without this kind of overshadowing presence of men. And so I guess what I'm getting at is, I think that there are it's a complicated issue, how to empower women, in this field and also in field work. But I think that we can get really creative and make even relatively small logistical fixes that can make a huge difference when thinking about empowering women in this field and creating these conservation leaders, kind of from the ground up. So that's how I'll answer that.
Great. Thank you, Kristine. Erin, what about you? Why is this so important to you?
I think it's very interesting to be in this current cohort of folks like in the early career stage going into conservation, because most of my colleagues are women. Most of the people in my program, in my PhD and in my master's, were all women. A lot of my classes in my undergrad were a lot of women. But then when you look at these kind of senior leadership positions in a lot of organizations, that proportion is very different, and there's a lot more men dominating those spaces. And there's been a lot of conversation recently, and I'm sure for a long time, but I think more in the spotlight recently about, this pipeline of people being lost between, what happens when 75% of the folks that I'm with now are women, but that's not being reflected later on. And so identifying where in that process women are being cut out of those spaces. And it's not just women, it's people of all different races and identities. And so where is that happening, and how can we prevent that? And I think the more people share their stories and feel comfortable coming forward with their own experiences, it identifies where those gaps are and kind of where those fixes need to be. And when I look at my generation, I'm just really excited to see where we all go next, because I just can't believe that the enthusiasm and the passion that I see and the support that we're getting more so now isn't going to translate to a better distribution or a better ratio, I think, of people in leadership soon.
Love it. Love it. And I've always heard, but maybe this is changing, that people who work on sharks tend to be male. Are you seeing that proportion changing as well?
Well, in my lab, there's 13 of us, I think, who are undergrads. I'm sorry, undergrads. I'm a PhD student. Who are in the graduate program in my lab, and I think 11 of us are women. So I think there's a ton of women in shark science, and it's really exciting to see. And there's also been a ton of conversations in our professional organizations around sharks and elasmobranchs of making sure it's a really inclusive space. Because I think, just to speak from a marine science standpoint, and I'm sure this probably applies across many standpoints, a lot of field-based research has historically been tough for women and not as inclusive. And so there's a lot of conversation about when you're in these remote field sites and away from home, how can we make that space a lot more accommodating for everyone? So.
Thank you so much. Paulina, why is this important to you? I know you do a lot of work on women and leadership up and down the Americas.
Well, this has always been something I've been very passionate about ever since even undergraduate work and so forth. And I think now being a mother, once you become a mother, you have like this chip also that activates suddenly inside of you that you want to do everything to protect your cubs and make the world better for them. So I think that's a driving force when I had my daughter and now we have two daughters with my second husband. So for me, it's seeing women who have always been change makers in the communities I've worked with. A story similar to Kristine doing community mapping, and we wanted to get the women's perspective on that, but we had to either do separate focal groups with men and women to be able to get their input, because in the shared spaces, women usually didn't speak, or in many cases where we were working, many women didn't even speak Spanish. So there's always that language barrier too. But I remember in this one case, working in this one community, we went to the president's house because we wanted to first get permission to even go to the community and be able to start working with the project. And we needed to get his permission as the official president. And so we were doing the initial community map with him, and his wife invited us in, and she was making coffee for us in the kitchen. But as he was sort of drawing on the map and explaining where things was, she kept yelling from the kitchen, "No, that's not right. No, that's not, you're not saying that correctly." And so finally she, was able to incorporate, and I gave her kind of the pen. It's like, well, why don't you tell us where things are? And she's like, yeah, okay. So in the end, we were able to have this really wonderful conversation with both the president and his wife, but just sort of seeing how much knowledge she had and a different perspective of just even their physical surroundings in the community and where the certain resources were. To me, that was enlightening. That was very early on in my career. So I've seen those sort of cases in, kind of this popcorn all over the regions and the places I've worked in the Amazon region in South America through projects or directly or the projects that we support. So I truly feel that is, to me, the driving force of future change. It doesn't mean that all that change is on women's shoulders. So I also want to make sure that it's not only our responsibility to resolve the problems we're in right now, but we've got to find those male allies and other alliances. Sorry, going back to my comment on building bridges, like we really do need to put this in a community sense. Otherwise, it's too much just to have it all on women's shoulders. But definitely women are the ones who are going to be forging forward the solutions.
Well said. Well said. Thank you for that. Tara, how about you? How does this manifest in your mind and your experience?
Yeah, well, I think being in primatology, I have been extremely lucky because I had amazing female role models between Diane Fossey and Jane Goodall and Birute Galdicus. I mean, the field of ape study was really led by women. So it was kind of easy to see a path forward. But what I want to do is make sure that I'm creating those opportunities, particularly for my African colleagues. and making sure that we are promoting women in science in Africa. And we're very proud of the fact that half of our scientists that we have on our team are women. And also, I think when we work a lot with local communities, and we know that women are actually, they control a lot of what's happening in the house. They make decisions about what families are eating. And so when we bring them along and they're part of conservation and we provide them with opportunities, then they can really make a difference for conservation. And you mentioned when you introduced me that we're building a campus, we're building a research center in Africa, and we have committed that 35% of the construction workforce will be female, and 35% of the leadership positions across the whole project will be female. And while I was in Rwanda a few weeks ago, I went to the Women's Association that they have formed, the female construction workers, and seeing how empowered they were by having a job and making money and being independent, and then being able to make decisions for their family and be ambassadors for conservation by working on this project. It just really reiterated the importance of making sure that women in local communities are at the table when we're talking about conservation.
Awesome. Awesome. I love that, having a kind of a set percentage. That's a great idea. I want to switch a little bit into what are some of the challenges that you personally have encountered, and then ask that you consider some advice you'd offer to our students who are in the audience tonight, who hopefully are like, I totally want to do what they're doing. How do I do it? So things that you've encountered as challenges, and then advice to our undergraduates who might be considering an adventure like this for their own life. I'll start with you, Kristine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the biggest challenge for me, especially since, as Erin said, like, we're in that part of the pipeline where there's still a lot of women. I'm a PhD student as well. And so I haven't felt so much, I've been kind of blessed to be able to be in this cohort where it's so full of women in conservation right now compared to the past. So the biggest challenge for me is actually more about field work. And Erin also mentioned this. I do most of my work alone, often at night, because I work on nocturnal animals. And I'm a pretty independent person. I've always been that way since I was a kid. And so it's really quite vexing to have to worry about my personal safety during field work in ways that men don't really have to think about. So overcoming that, which is, way down the road for some folks who are just getting started, but it just means kind of having a plan in place. I think it's more difficult when you're starting your own project, which is what I have done. But often there are existing projects that you're tapping into, and you can do kind of the legwork to be like, okay, what is your safety plan here? Like, ask the people in charge what the safety plans are, and what kinds of trainings people are getting on bias and microaggressions and things like that. For me, since I'm on my own project, I kind of bring the tools that I can to make me feel prepared for dangerous situations. So like, I bring like weaponry and things, but it's just the truth. And I kind of make the hard choices about who I choose to be with after dark. And sometimes you are on your own like that, and you have to kind of make those choices, and also be tender with yourself if you don't feel courageous enough. Like, let yourself not do that, and make those choices, which can be difficult. And then as far as like how folks can do this work, and also do this work in a more inclusive way, I would say it's come up in our conversation already, but take advantage of opportunities. Don't be afraid to cold email people. Don't be afraid to reach out to people who look like you or who are role models for you. And the worst thing that can happen is that they won't respond. Like, that's really the worst that can happen. Almost every single thing that I have done has been from taking opportunities. As a matter of fact, my first job that I spoke to you about, Kasokwa Forest Project, came from where I actually met Erica, who planned this event. Was my study abroad with School for Field Studies in Kenya and Tanzania during my junior year of undergrad. One of the professors actually is the founder of that project, and I had stayed in touch with her. And then after I graduated, I was like, all right, I'm gonna come work on your project. And she was like, excellent, we need someone. And that's how that happened. Like, it wouldn't have happened otherwise without just like kind of putting myself out there. And as far as kind of, thinking about being inclusive and kind of building up yourself and others, if you're from a historically minoritized group, I would say what we really need to do is know that women and people of color who are doing this work are out here. I mean, you see some of us right here in front of you, and there are more and more of us out here doing conservation work. So the field is changing really quickly. We're here for you. Don't be afraid to reach out. We need to all, at the same time, make sure we all lift each other up with us. So when you're rising, don't just rise, bring someone with you on the way up. In your work, you can think deeply about how you can support and elevate, your undergraduate students, your mentees, your field team, the community members that you know, and bring those people up with you as conservation leaders. Don't just leave them there, or don't just kind of do research on people, do research with people, and hold yourself to goals around that. And I guess the last thing I want to say on this is I really, really want us to get to the point where we're no longer trying to be the first female or the first Black carnivore ecologist. I want those roads to already be paved with so many inspirational leaders that have come before. And I think it's already happening. So.
See, I told you we were all going to be inspired. Woo! So good. Thank you, Kristine. Erin, how about you? What are you thinking in terms of advice you'd give, but also maybe some challenges or barriers you've encountered?
What a tough act to follow. I really love Kristine talking about pulling people as you rise. I mean, I felt like I needed, in order to help someone, you need to be like super well established in your career and have been doing this for decades. And even something as simple as giving advice to someone who's a year younger than you, or trying to go through the application process to something you've already done. But I do want to touch on, unfortunately, I have a similar story to Kristine about some of the challenges we've encountered in the field. One of the things I love most about what I do is I get to go to these beautiful, very remote places. But unfortunately, that can sometimes mean that you feel very isolated and vulnerable. And so I have been in instances where I am one of the few women, and especially one of the youngest, where I've experienced harassment and situations that make me feel very isolated. And so I think that's unfortunately something that has come up quite a bit in the field of marine science. And there was also a really wonderful piece written in Scientific American recently, specifically about shark science. When you're on a boat, like I've been on a boat for 2 weeks with 6 people where we don't get off the boat. I mean, and I think one of the main things I've learned from that is to just never question why I'm there. I mean, it can really make you feel like it is the only reason I'm here for something else, but no, it's, you know your abilities and you know what you've done to get to this point, and you deserve to be there, and no one has the right to make you feel otherwise. And I think it has really made me think carefully and ask hard questions about who I collaborate with. I mean, when I was interviewing for my master's and interviewing for my PhD, I asked questions about how do you make sure that your students feel safe in the field, and what are the measures that you take about that? And it was really telling, because some people were like, oh, it's not something I've thought about before. And I was like, well, that's not good. You should always be thinking, anyone that's in the field, you should be thinking about their safety. And so I also always try to be that person that not to be afraid to bring that up with my other collaborators and other younger folks in the field as well. So as far as advice, on a much happier note, I guess, one thing that I would say is definitely do not let no be the end when it comes to seeking opportunities. I mean, one of my grants that took me to Fiji for a couple of months to do this incredible research, I had to apply and get rejected for that grant, 4 or 5 times before it was finally funded. But when you do that final presentation, no one knows that it was rejected 5 times. So it just not letting rejections define you and make you think like you're not fit for this field. It's actually part of the field. You're going to apply and get rejected to a lot of things. So just keep applying.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Erin. We are now going to go to our audience for questions. So I apologize to Tara and Paulina for not being able to give you some time to give advice, but anyone who's here tonight, I know you can reach out to these women for ideas, support, love, don't do this, do that, all of that. We'll start with questions from the webinar audience. And I love this question, which is, how can we create mentorship and kinship programs that create more lift for women? And does this proverb have any relevance? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. I know that many of you have worked in Africa, but I'll start with you, Tara, since you most recently just came back from there in your adventure to Rwanda. But how can we create some programs to raise each other up?
I think it's an, something that we have to be very thoughtful about and cognizant that some people, that opportunities are not equally available, and be really active and think about it. I mean, we work very hard. I mean, a lot of our work is focused on training the next generation of African conservationists. And it's an area that I think we've spent a lot of time being very purposeful for, developing programs, finding funding for those programs, and making sure that those programs are not things that are what we do, in addition to our work, but it is an integral part of our work. Our work is to save gorillas, and part of saving gorillas is making sure that people on the ground have the skill sets that they need to do it. So it has to be purposeful. I think it has to be intentional. And I think we have to work together. This is an area where collaboration can make such a difference. We can't go it alone. The challenges we're facing on the ground are too big. And so creating these networks where you can introduce people. So much, I think, of the conservation world is getting introduced. You meet someone and they say, well, I can't help you with that, but let me introduce you to my colleague that I know is working on that. And really creating those type of networks, I think, is incredibly important to helping people move forward and succeed.
Awesome. Thank you, Tara. Paulina, you're involved in some networks. Can you share some thoughts about which ones have worked and where you see some room for improvement or ideas you might have?
Yeah, and wonderful question from Nicole, who Nicole herself has been mentoring many women conservationists for a long time. And I believe in both formal and informal networks. So, Tara was mentioning sometimes there's these informal networks in conservation that by word of mouth, you really get to know people. And I find that it's a field that's usually very generous about collaborating or sharing information. And when it's not generous, you find ways around it too. But I think that I've been discovering these more formal networks in Latin America. I've been getting more involved with the Women in Conservation Latin America network, and it's just sort of bringing women together from different countries. And I think we're getting more traction now because we are all in working from home, and because of the pandemic, we've just been more connected. And we just spent 3 days with the Women in Conservation Leadership Summit that was incredibly inspiring, of bringing over 200 women together from the US and other places around the world. So I think these formal networks are definitely important, but the challenge there is that you always need one person or a group of people who are the motors of that, and to make the network actually motivating, because it's volunteer. So you really have to see what add value has for that. But I think in these times, and what I've usually found connecting with women, is that there's always an incentive, and it's usually very reciprocal. So you give and take as you can. I think we also need to sort of just break some barriers of sometimes language or places that we are, so it's not so siloed, and that we can learn from each other in a more fluid way. And to Tara's point of being very intent on it. So I if people reach out to me, I always respond, especially young professionals coming into conservation and saying, how do I break into this, or how do I do this? And I don't mind doing that because it's so important. And whatever grain of salt that I can pass on to others, I'm glad to do it. But I know not everybody is willing to do that. So I think those of us who are in the field and have a little bit more years of experience. I'm not saying that it's good or bad, but if we're able to share a little bit more of our knowledge with others, glad to do that. And I think that's important.
Thank you, Paulina. That's awesome. I want to remind the students and our special guests in Williamsburg that you can actually ask questions from there in the amphitheater. You can walk up to the microphone in front of the amphitheater to ask a question. So I just want to make sure to include all of you. I'm imagining all of you stretched out there on the lawn or sitting on the benches. I'll ask one more question while we're seeing if there's any questions from the group there. I wonder if you all can get on a time machine with me and go back to the time in your life when you were like 15, 16 years old. Look at her. What advice would you give her from where you are now? Can I start with you, Kristine?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Computer is freezing. 15 or 16-year-old Kristine was living in a dysfunctional home, and I think she was excited to get the heck out of it. So you didn't have to tell her twice to go to undergrad. But I think I would tell her, like, keep pursuing your dream of working with wildlife. Don't be afraid of the fact that you have no idea how to get there. Poke more people earlier in time. Don't wait on cold emails. I didn't learn how to cold email until I was like a senior in college, and I think it's a wasted time. And I think I would just tell her, like, things get better, and like,
uh-oh. Things get better, and then she froze. And we're literally like miles away. She's just over there in Berkeley. Okay, hold that thought, Kristine. Oh, she's back.
Am I back? I don't know what you
back.
heard, but
The last thing we heard was it gets better.
Yeah, that's basically it. It gets better. It felt, I'm sure I felt very out of control of my life at that time. And I felt like, you know, getting into the conservation field really kind of empowered me to learn how to be an individual and kind of feel more on top of my own life for the first time ever, kind of when I was 18. So I would tell her, like,
plus you carry weapons sometimes.
Plus I carry weapons sometimes, yes.
Thank you for sharing that. Erin, what about you? What advice would you give yourself looking back?
I think I would tell myself that just because you don't know something doesn't mean that you won't know it in the future, or that you're not good at something. It just means that you're not good yet. I mean, I feel like I took some of those intro classes or AP classes, and because I didn't click with physics, my thought was, well, I'm bad at physics. And that's not true. I just didn't know. I just hadn't learned it well yet. And now I'm doing things that I never thought I would do when I couldn't stand chemistry. And now a huge part of my PhD chapter is chemistry, and I'm doing physics. And so I think just being kinder to myself about, like, everyone learns things at different times. And sometimes it just depends on the situation that you're in. Maybe that teacher or professor doesn't teach in a way that really clicks with the way you learn, but then you will meet someone that does. And so I would say, be kind about, like, what you can learn, and just have trust in yourself that you could really learn anything that you put your mind to.
Love it. Love it. Thank you. And it sounds like someone is walking up to the mic. Are they close to the mic yet?
Okay. Can you hear me? Oh.
Yes. Oh, yeah. There you are.
I was wondering, especially somewhere like William and Mary, where you have so many options, how do you find a path to pursue? And especially with a lot of conservation, it is very time intensive to, like, really get to something. And how do you, at least for me, how do you, like, embrace the fear of, like, missing out on other things by focusing on one thing when there's so much?
Oh, God, I remember that feeling. How do you embrace the fear of missing out and focusing on something and missing out on other things? Paulina, you're nodding. Do you have some advice or memory about that time? And how you navigated that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I have those even now. Sometimes I still have those feelings like, oh my God, where am I going? What am I going to do? But I would just say you choose a path and begin there, and things do sort of branch out. Like you'll start coming across other paths along the way. Things open up, but you just have to be awake and keep your eyes out for those paths when they do open up. Like it's an opportunity. It might be a connection with somebody. It might be a book you read, an article. You really just don't know right away. But if you're not attuned to those things kind of presenting themselves in front of you, you're going to miss out. So I would say definitely choose a path that you feel confident and you really want to kind of dig deep in. But as soon as you start doing that, even that's going to open you up to other paths, and don't be afraid of that either. So it's a hard first decision, but once you're in it, you're going to discover things that are wonderful.
Tara, how about you? What advice would you have? You work with a lot of academics in your current role. How do you choose when you have so many good options at a wonderful institution like William and Mary?
I would agree with what Paulina said. I think it is important to just kind of take the plunge and choose a path. And I think also to be aware, sometimes you do choose a path that may be wrong, or it may not be the perfect one. I took a lot of undergraduate students to Africa, and so many of them thought they wanted to study animal behavior. And they realized after sitting in a field watching zebras eat for 10 hours that this was not nearly as glamorous as it seemed on television. And the great thing is, and I think this goes to the building bridges that we talked about earlier, they went on to all different types of careers, but they had this knowledge and love of having gone to Africa and seen conservation that they took with them. And that's what we need. We don't just need conservationists doing conservation. We need doctors and lawyers and bankers and teachers that all care about this profession. So I think choose a path. Don't be afraid that maybe if you get further down it and you see something you want to do differently, to go in that direction. I think about that all the time, that I thought I was going to be a vet and I ended up, being a totally different type of scientist. So, but moving forward is always good, and don't be afraid to take leaps when opportunities are offered to you.
Thank you for your question. So important. One final question for you, Kristine, as we close out, because your work is so in line with what's happening in the United States, but really all over the world, with the deaths of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and so many countless members of our Black community. You're working on this. You're doing the thing. It's not easy to forge this path. It's not clear. What gives you hope, and what's propelling you forward to work on social justice and environment at the same time?
Great questions. And I'll just answer using Black Mammalogists Week as an example. So although I am a co-founder of Black Mammalogists Week, the co-organizers that we brought on board, there are 18 of us. And essentially, just by creating this vision, we were able, all Black mammalogists and wildlife ecologists were able to come together from all different walks of life and some different countries and make this whole movement and this, this event and this organization out of scratch. And I made so many new friends that I honestly didn't know existed until I looked at Twitter for the first time. And so I think that what that shows you is not only are we here, Black and Indigenous scholars who work on wildlife and work on conservation, but there's also more and more ways to connect easily with one another and to really create those mentorship opportunities. And another thing that came out of Black Mammalogists Week is that we decided that we wanted to make an endowed scholarship through the American Society of Mammalogists that we're setting up with them, where each year there would be a certain number of grants that's given out to Black and Indigenous scholars working on mammals and on wildlife conservation, because there's those small little logistical things that are always really difficult when you're a scholar, things like books and research supplies and travel supplies and conference fees and publication fees that just don't get funded nearly enough in general, and definitely not targeted toward, historically minoritized groups. And just in that 1 week, we raised almost a third of the endowment. And so we're still working on that fundraiser, but just seeing so many people from all around the world coming together to support Black and Indigenous scholars was just so inspiring, and I think indicative of how people are feeling about increasing representation in conservation. So I think that all of those things gave me hope, and we'll be probably running Black Mammalogists Week again next year and have lots of events until then that can kind of raise that awareness and elevate folks.
Thank you for that awesome work. And thank you to all the panelists. I wrote down so many things. You all gave me ideas. And as I said, no matter your age, you're always in need of a shot in the arm of, how do I get through this? How do I navigate? What's the next step for me? Is this the right thing to be doing? And the younger women that are coming up through the pipeline, stay in it. We got to figure out how to keep you there and be flexible and let you do all the things you dream of. We need you more than ever. The world needs you more than ever. I'd like to thank William and Mary and the Institute for Integrative Conservation. It's been awesome being with you all tonight. And I just really want to thank the students that are here tonight. I'm not there physically, we're not together, but we're more connected than ever before. And one day we will physically be able to give each other hugs. But until then, I hope you all stay safe, and I'll hand it back to John. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristine. Wonderful job moderating the panel, and the panel, all of you. It was amazing, truly inspiring. And I hope that you can hear perhaps a round of applause for the whole panel from the audience. Thank you for your insights, your passion, your compassion, your empathy. This is the start of a big collaboration for us at William & Mary with the launch of the IIC, the Institute for Integrative Conservation. Conservation is a complex problem that involves every aspect of society, so it has to start with inclusion. There's no other way forwards to make this all work. And we have to go there together. So thank you, panel, for your inspiring words. And thank you, everyone, for coming, especially people on the webinar. Thank you for tuning in. And I hope you have a great rest of the evening. And for the people who are staying in Williamsburg, just hold on for a second, and I'll give you some instructions about how we're going to do leaving the amphitheater safely as well. If you want to get involved with the IIC, please reach out to us at iic@wm.edu, or contact any of us. You know who we are. And as the panel was saying, they've invited you to follow up with them as well. So please take those opportunities to be involved. So good night, and thank you, everybody.